Good morning, everyone. If you can please find your seat, thank you so much. Welcome on a cold and rainy day that's warm in here and in fellowship. I'm Jane Kamensky. I'm the president and CEO of Monticello, and I'm so happy to welcome you here on a very special day on which we celebrate the leadership and service of ordinary American citizens doing extraordinary things. That kind of citizen leadership has been since we became a nation of citizens in 1776 and will continue as long as the Republic endures to be the true source of American greatness. We have historically called today Founders Day with an apostrophe. One founder, our man TJ. Jefferson, I think, would not approve of this. He used the word founder only a handful of times among his 22,000 letters, never with a capital F and never for himself. In fact, he used the term more often in its printing context, as in a type founder or a melter of lead, than its political or imperial context, as in the founders of Mexico, as he said in one 1787 letter. The phrase founding fathers was Warren G. Harding's coinage when he was a senator in 1911. Jefferson would have hated it. For though Jefferson acknowledged that some people began important things, he referenced, for example, the subscribers and founders of the University of Virginia, he was far more interested in the ways that new generations of Americans continually built upon the foundations laid down by their predecessors. Founders put down cornerstones, the living, the young, the generations yet unborn, we the people, built the building, which remains by definition unfinished. And Monticello itself is a great metaphor here, the site of continual rebuilding over decades. So I'd like to think of today as Founders Day, plural, not possessive. We are all, you are all, founders and continual refounders and rediscoverers of the promise of the United States, as sketched nowhere better than in the Declaration of Independence. Our Citizen Leadership Medalist, Bryan Stevenson, is one of those who puts in the work to build toward the Declaration's promise every day. And it's my pleasure now to turn the podium over to my friend and colleague, Ms. Micheline Mickey Woodard, Vice Chair of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation's Board of Trustees, to introduce Mr. Stevenson as our keynote speaker. Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. I will be quick because you don't want to hear from me. But let me tell you, it is truly a very rare privilege to introduce someone who doesn't just speak about justice, he lives it. He lives it. He lives it with fierce love and with moral imagination. Bryan Stevenson's journey began in a small, segregated community in Delaware. Long before Harvard Law, before arguing at the Supreme Court, before founding the Equal Justice Initiative, he was a child, and he was learning piano in his family's modest home. He practiced classical pieces like Chopin and Debussy, and not because he imagined concert halls, but because music gave him stillness and it gave him space. He said that music helped him learn how to listen to silence, to nuance, to suffering, and in that attentive listening, he began to understand justice not as punishment, but as presence, not as vengeance, but as mercy. Jefferson, too, cherished music, not only as a comfort, but as a teacher. And in a lesser-known letter to a friend, he wrote, "I have a full confidence in the better part of mankind and the hope that what is right will finally prevail." Bryan Stevenson is proof of that hope. His work is grounded in remembering the names, the lives, and the humanity of those so forgotten. Through the Legacy Museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice, he has told America's hard stories, not to reopen wounds, but to finally begin healing. He reminded us that proximity is a form of power and that we must get close to brokenness if we want to build something whole. He reminded us that the opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice. And through his life, his advocacy, his scholarship, his artful compassion, he has made justice feel not like an abstract idea, but a living, breathing force. It is truly one of the biggest honors of my lifetime to welcome the 2025 Thomas Jefferson Foundation Medalist in Citizen Leadership, Mr. Bryan Stevenson.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. It is a really special privilege to be on these grounds with all of you on this really significant day. Thomas Jefferson believed and was often quoted for his belief that honesty is the first chapter in the book of wisdom. Jefferson wrote and talked a lot about character because he believed that the success of America, the success of this venture into democracy, multiracial democracy, was going to require a kind of character that wasn't overwhelmed by fear or anger. And there have been times in our history when we haven't always overcome the politics of fear and anger, when we haven't always been honest. But I think on this day, it's worth reflecting and thinking about the need to be honest, the need to be truth tellers, to fully imagine, to fully embrace, to fully advance the most noble ideas of Thomas Jefferson. And that means we have to think about the identity we create each day. Being an American doesn't create an identity that you're assigned. I think the identity that we have is the identity that we earn, that we create, that we make for ourselves. And I think we talk too little about the importance of identity. When I think about the teachers who had the biggest impact on me, they weren't the teachers who had the biggest impact because they were fourth grade teachers or sixth grade teachers. It wasn't their title or their status. It was the way they did the work they did. It was the compassionate teachers, the loving teachers, the kind teachers, the teachers who weren't afraid to embrace me, that made me believe things I hadn't seen. Those were the teachers that had an impact on my life. I talk to physicians sometimes, and I try to get them to understand that it's not your knowledge. Your knowledge is key. Your knowledge is important. But the physicians that actually create healing and hope for their patients are the physicians who listen, the physicians who are compassionate, the physicians who are caring. I'm in court all of the time, and I see lawyers that may know the facts, may know the law, but I see them interacting with their clients, and they're not instilling the kind of confidence and trust. And that identity is going to be key to their effectiveness. I talk about identity a lot, not just based on my work, but because it was taught to me by my grandmother. I talk about my grandmother all the time. I'm going to repeat a story I've told before, but because my grandmother was born just 60 miles from here in Caroline County, the daughter of people who were enslaved, I've been thinking about her the whole time I've been here. And my grandmother was a force of nature. She was tough, she was strong, but but she was kind and she was loving. She was the quintessential African-American matriarch. She was the power in our family. She was the end of every argument in our family. She was also the start of a lot of arguments in our family. And my challenge was that she had 10 children, and my mom was the youngest of her 10 kids. And whenever I would spend time with her, it seemed like my older cousins had figured out how to get her attention much more effectively than I had. And I woke up one morning when I was 9 or 10 years old, and I went into the living room and my cousins were running around, but my grandmother was sitting across the room, and it seemed like she was staring at me. And I would look away, and then I'd look back at her, and she'd still be staring. And I couldn't figure out what she was doing. And then she got up and she walked across the room and she came over to me and she said, "Come on, Bryan, you and I are going to have a talk out back." And she took me by the hand and took me back outside to the back of the house. She sat me down and she said, "Now I'm going to tell you something, but you can't tell anybody what I tell you." I said, "Okay, Mama." She said, "I've been watching you." And she said, "I think you're special." She said, "I think you can do anything you want to do." I remember staring at my mother, just being so excited to hear her say those words. And then she said, "Bryan, but you've got to promise me 3 things. I said, "Okay, Mama." She said, "The first thing I need you to promise me is that you'll always take care of your mom." She said, "That's my baby girl. I need to know that someone's going to take care of her when I'm gone. So you have to promise me you'll always take care of your mom." Well, I adored my mom. So I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." And then she said, "The second thing I need you to promise me is that you'll always do the right thing, even when the right thing is the hard thing." I thought about it and I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." And then she said, "The last thing I need you to promise me is that you'll never drink alcohol." Well, I was 9 years old, so I said, "Yes, Mama, I'll do that." I have a brother who's a year older and a sister who's a year younger. And when I was about 14 or 15, one day my brother came home and somewhere he had gotten beer. I don't know where he got this beer, but he grabbed me and my sister and we went out back and he opened up this beer and he had some and he gave some to my sister and she had some and they offered it to me, but I hesitated. I said, no, I don't think I'm going to have any beer." My brother said, "What's wrong with you? I have some beer. You have some. Your sister had some. I had some. You have some." I said, no, that's okay. And my brother was like, "No, have some beer." I said, no, that's okay. And then my brother stared at me. And then he said, "I hope you're not still hung up on that conversation Mama had with you." I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, "Oh, Mama tells all the grandchildren that they're special." I was devastated. But I'm going to admit something to you because I'm being honored with this really, really glorious award. I'm obviously a lot older, but I'm going to admit to you this morning on these hallowed grounds that even though I'm a lot older, I have never had a drop of alcohol in my life. And I don't say that, I don't say that because I think there's something virtuous about that. I say that because I believe that when we create identities that are rooted in compassion, when we create identities that are rooted in our commitment to other beings, to other human rights, other people's dignities, we can say things that will inspire us to do things we must do. Our identity, when it's rooted in truth-telling and honesty and compassion and uplifting the rights of people who are sometimes disfavored, that kind of identity can create greatness. And I believe our nation can be greater than it has ever been. I do not think we have reached the space that we really need to reach in this country to be truly fulfilling of the vision of Thomas Jefferson. We've at times been dishonest. We haven't always been truth tellers. I look at the history of racial injustice in this country and it burdens me to know how often we haven't been honest. For so many decades, we didn't talk honestly about what happened to indigenous peoples when Europeans came to this continent. There's a story there that we need to understand. That community of people were forced off their lands. They were subjected to all kinds of abuse. The population dropped from 8 million to less than 500,000 by the end of the 1800s. And it's a story that's a painful story, but it is a necessary story for us to understand if we're going to become better stewards of this land. We created the great Constitution, the Declaration that Thomas Jefferson penned and that talked about equality and justice for all, but we didn't apply those concepts to Native people. We instead said, "Oh no, those Native people, they're savages." And this narrative of racial difference was born, and that narrative spread. And I believe that narrative was the great evil of American slavery. Being in this space, we cannot ignore the burden, the stain, the pain and anguish that slavery created in America, 10 million Black people enslaved for 246 years. And I don't think the great harm of slavery was the involuntary servitude and the forced labor and all of the cruelty. I think the great harm of slavery was the narrative that we created to justify enslavement. And I think the tension you see in Jefferson's writings when he's both talking about the harm of slavery, the wrongfulness of slavery, while still enslaving other people, was a reflection of an awareness that this narrative was false, but yet everybody was submitting to it. People who enslaved other people didn't want to think of themselves as immoral or indecent or unchristian, so they needed a narrative. And it actually hardened after Jefferson dies. It's in the 1830s and the 1840s when hundreds of thousands of enslaved people were being pushed to this new South. And these states of Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana are making so much profit for white landowners that slavery became entrenched and that narrative was reinforced. And we've created this false narrative, this dishonest narrative that continues to burden us. We created this myth that Black people aren't as good as white people, that Black people are less caring, less capable, less worthy, less human, less evolved. And that narrative gave rise to these 246 years of enslavement. And the narrative was very powerful. It gave kind of birth to this ideology of racial hierarchy, of white supremacy. And it was so powerful, it survived the end of the Civil War. I told the group yesterday that I believe the North won the Civil War, but the South won the narrative war. Those ideas of racial hierarchy, they persisted. They were so powerful that even when Congress creates a 14th Amendment to protect formerly enslaved people, and it creates a 15th Amendment to create a right to vote for formerly enslaved people, our courts refused to enforce those rights because they didn't want to violate this narrative of racial hierarchy, what they called states' rights. And that gave rise to a century of lynching and terror violence because Black people weren't going to submit to this narrative on their own. They had made an extraordinary decision at the end of the Civil War to not seek revenge and retribution against the people who had enslaved them. They made the extraordinary decision to believe in America, to commit to building a better America. And they started building churches and schools. They committed to their families. They committed to citizen leadership. And they were exercising that opportunity until Reconstruction collapses. And we abandoned these 4 million people who had been enslaved. And then that era of terror violence took hold. Black people being pulled out of their homes, beaten, drowned, tortured, lynched on courthouse lawns. My grandmother left this area after her uncle was the victim of a racial terror lynching not too far from here. And that trauma was something that many people carried with them. 6 million Black people flee the American South during the first half of the 20th century. And we never talked about it. We were dishonest about our lawlessness in this country. Our courts failed to do what they should have done. And then in the 50s and 60s, a courageous community of people said, we can't tolerate this anymore. These citizen leaders organized and began to march. They boycotted the buses in Montgomery. They challenged segregation in Greensboro, North Carolina. They crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. And because of their citizen leadership, we tore down the legal architecture of Jim Crow and segregation. But the narrative persisted. The presumption of dangerousness and guilt persisted. And so here we sit in 2025, and we are still struggling to overcome this narrative, this presumption, this bigotry that continues to kind of be in our world, our space, like pollution. And so I believe to really advance this vision that Jefferson gave us, we have to do something different. We have to be truth tellers. And I think the most powerful citizen leaders in our time, the citizen leaders we need the most, are people who are committed to truth and justice, truth and repair, truth and restoration, truth and reconciliation. We need an era of truth telling. We need an era of the kind of honesty that Jefferson talked about. In South Africa, after apartheid, they committed to truth and reconciliation, and it allowed them to make some progress. They gave space for the victims of apartheid to talk about their pain. They gave space to the perpetrators to talk about their regret. If you go to Berlin, Germany, you can't go 200 meters without seeing markers and stones that have been placed next to the homes of Jewish families that were killed during the Holocaust. There's been a reckoning. There's been some honesty about the horrors of the Holocaust. The Holocaust Memorial sits in the center of Berlin. The cab drivers and the hotel operators encourage everybody to go experience those memorials. In Germany, you are required to master an understanding of the Holocaust before you graduate. You can't graduate from high school without demonstrating a knowledge of the Holocaust. They don't have people saying, oh, we can't talk about the Holocaust. That might make somebody uncomfortable or ashamed. It's the opposite. And that honesty is what allowed us to be a trusted partner, allowed them to be someone that we can work with. It allows all of us to go to Germany and feel what we are doing. There are no Adolf Hitler statues in Berlin. There are no monuments to the perpetrators of the Holocaust. But in our country, we have struggled to be honest, to reckon with this legacy. And I believe that our citizen leaders now have to lead, because there are forces in our country, very loud forces, very powerful voices, that are trying to silence citizen leaders who want to talk honestly about our history. They believe that ignorance is better than enlightenment, that forgetting things that can teach us what we need to know is a better path forward. They want to actually ban books and limit what is taught and limit what you learn. And I think we have to do the opposite. I think to honor Jefferson means we have to be committed to the kind of honesty that creates a wise and healthy nation. In Montgomery, we've created sites, the Legacy Museum, the National Memorial, Freedom Monument Sculpture Park, and we created these sites for them to be truth-telling spaces. And I want to invite everyone here to come and visit our sites in Montgomery. And when you get to our museum, you're going to see this exhibit, which is 800 jars of soil. We have a project where we're trying to put up markers at every lynching site in America, because I don't think we've done a very good job of being honest about the places of harm and heartbreak that era of lynching created. So we want to put a marker up at every lynching site. And when we put these markers up, people dig soil, and they put the soil in the jar with the name of the victim and the date, and then they bring it back to our museum. So we have a collection of 800 jars of soil that you'll see when you come to our museum. And every now and then somebody will call me and say, Mr. Stevenson, I want to be a part of the soil digging. I want to be a citizen leader. And an older Black woman called me a couple years ago and said, Mr. Stevenson, I want to do something to help that project. She said, do you have any counties where no one's dug the soil? I said, well, actually, we do. And I asked her if she'd be willing to go to this county in West Alabama to dig the soil, and she said she would. And she came and she got the jar with the name of the victim and the date. She got a memo that talked about the lynching. We gave her an implement to dig the soil, and she went to that county. She said when she got there, though, she had to pray before she got out of her car. She said, Mr. Stevenson, I didn't know it was going to be scary like that. It was a dirt road in the middle of the woods. It was intimidating and kind of scary. She said, I had to pray before I got my courage to get out of the car. But I got my courage, Mr. Stevenson, and I got out of the car and I crossed the dirt road. I found the spot where the man was lynched. I got down on my knees and I was ready to start digging. But then this pickup truck came down that dirt road, and there was this big white guy in the truck, and he stared at her as he drove by. She said her heart started to pound. And to her horror, this man drove by, parked his truck, turned it around, and drove back by again and stared at her some more. She said she started to get afraid. And then to her horror, the man parked his truck, got out, and started walking toward her. We tell people when they're digging soil that they don't have to explain what they're doing. We say, look, if you want to just say you're getting dirt for your garden, that's totally fine. And the man walked up to her and he said, what are you doing? And she told me that she was going to tell this man, I'm just getting dirt for my garden. She said, but all of a sudden, Mr. Stevenson, something got a hold of me. And she said, I told that man, I'm digging soil here because this is where a Black man was lynched in 1937, and I'm going to honor his life today. She said she just looked down and started digging. And the man stood there, but he surprised her. He said, does that memo talk about the lynching? And she said, it does. And then he said, can I read it? And she said, yes. And she gave the man the memo, and he started reading while she started digging. And after the man finished reading the memo, he really surprised her. He said, excuse me, ma'am, but would it be all right if I helped you? And she said, yes. And the man got down on his knees next to her, and she offered him the implement to dig the soil. And he said, no, 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 you keep that. I'll just use my hands. And she said, this man started throwing his hands into the soil and putting it in the jar, throwing his hands into the soil and putting it into the jar. And she said there was something about the conviction with which he was putting his whole body into picking up this soil that just moved her. And she said, Mr. Stevenson, I went from fear to relief to joy so quickly. I couldn't help it. Tears started running down my face. And the man saw her tears and he looked at her and he said, oh, ma'am, I'm so sorry. I'm upsetting you. And she said, no, 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 no. She said, you're blessing me. And he kept digging with his hands and she kept digging with the implement, and they were getting near the top of the jar. And she looked over at him and she noticed that the man had slowed down. His face had turned red. His shoulders were sagging. She said she finally saw a tear running down his face. And she reached over and she put her hand on his shoulder and she said, are you all right? And he said, no, ma'am, no, ma'am. And he turned to her and he closed his eyes. He said, I'm just so worried that it might have been my grandfather who helped lynch this man. She said they both sat on that roadside and wept. After a few minutes, the man turned to her and he said, ma'am, I really want to take a picture of you holding the jar of soil. She said, okay, but I really want to take a picture of you holding the jar of soil. So they took pictures of one another holding this jar of soil. And she said, well, I'm going back to Montgomery to put this in the museum. And the man said, would it be all right if I just followed you back? And she said, yes. And on the way back, this woman called me. She said, Mr. Stevenson, I want you to come to the museum. I want you to meet my new friend. And I was there when these two people who met on a roadside in a place of pain and violence and bigotry came in and did something beautiful by putting that jar of soil in the exhibit. I'm not naive. I don't think beautiful things like that always happen when we tell the truth. But I believe we deny ourselves the beauty of justice when we refuse to tell the truth. She was a citizen leader. She was a truth teller. And we can all be citizen leaders by committing to remaining truth tellers, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's uncomfortable, even when some folks think that we shouldn't be doing that. It is necessary if we are going to honor the legacy and the vision of Thomas Jefferson. I can't be in this space without thinking about my enslaved descendant, my enslaved great-grandparents. And I believe more than anything, they would want their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren to keep fighting for the truth of real equality, real justice. I believe there is something better waiting for us. I think there's something that feels more like freedom, more like equality, more like justice, and it's waiting for us. And I believe that Thomas Jefferson would want us to be the kind of citizen leaders that achieve that great thing that is still in front of us. And so I'm honored to be a part of this celebration. I'm honored to receive this award because what I receive when what I feel when I receive this is a call, a challenge not to sit down, but a challenge to stand up, a challenge not to be quiet, but a challenge to keep speaking, a challenge to be a truth teller for the kind of just world that we all so desperately need. Thank you all very, very much.
A heartfelt thanks to you, Bryan. It's so hard to follow that. I think we all just need to take a breath and just feel the emotion. Good morning. I'm Molly Hardy, Chair of the Board of Trustees of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, and it is my greatest honor to be with you here today and to introduce you to Mr. Martez Tolbert Tez. In accordance with the recognition of the immeasurable career of Bryan Stevenson and the Equal Justice Initiative's work with the communities that have been marginalized by poverty and discouraged by unequal treatment, Monticello is humbled to recognize the Fountain Fund's efforts to increase economic opportunities and reduce obstacles for formerly incarcerated people in the Commonwealth and beyond. We are honored to present the 2025 Thomas Jefferson Award in Citizen Service to the Fountain Fund, continuing our tradition of recognizing an organization in the Charlottesville, Albemarle community doing the work to strengthen the bonds among us to ensure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all. We invite National Director of Client and Community Engagement, Mr. Martez Tolbert Tez, to accept the Thomas Jefferson Foundation Award in Citizen Service on behalf of the Fountain Fund. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Tez to the podium.
Good morning, everybody. Before I get started, first and foremost, I want to thank the Thomas Jefferson Foundation for this incredible honor. Receiving the Citizen of Service Award is deeply humbling for me, but not just for me, but for the entire Fountain Fund family that's here today. Big shout out to Erica Facilio, our chairman, Tim Heafy, our board members, client partners, volunteers, community partners. They all in the front 3 rows. Big shout out to everybody. The recognition is not just about our work. It's about the people we serve. It's about resilience, strength, and dignity for those who've been impacted by the justice system and are fighting every day to reclaim their futures. As I stand before you today as a national director, I can't help but reflect on my own personal journey. I spent 10 years behind bars. 10 years told what I couldn't and couldn't do, who I was, and who I would never be. When I walked out of those prison doors, the world didn't welcome me back with open arms. Instead, I faced the same challenges and barriers that millions of returning citizens do. Doors being closed to unemployment, housing, financial insecurity, all because of my past. I was told my bad decisions would define me forever. But that's not the truth. And I know that because of the work of people like Bryan Stevenson, who has powerfully reminded us of this. Each of us is more than our worst thing that we ever done. I love that quote. Those words are more than just a statement to me. They're a call to action. They are the foundation of the work we do at the Fountain Fund. We exist to ensure that formerly incarcerated individuals, people like myself and our client partners, are given a real chance to restore strength through financial security, support, advocacy, and community engagement. We help returning citizens access housing, start businesses, basically taking back control of their futures. Because of a second chance isn't a privilege, it should be a right. We all know the obstacles, the stigma, the systematic barriers, that the way society often looks past those who need help the most. But I am here today because somebody believed in me, the Fountain Fund. Because someone saw more than just my past, and I made a promise to my moms and to my community to do the same for others, just like me. That's why the Fountain Fund exists, not just to offer loans, but to affirm dignity and respect and to restore hope and opportunities where none existed before. As we celebrate, thank you. As we celebrate this milestone today, let's not forget the bigger picture. The true measure of our justice system, as Bryan Stevenson has powerfully said, it's not about how we treat the wealthy and the privileged, but it's how we treat the poor, the vulnerable, and the incarcerated. If we want a more just society, we must invest in those who have been left behind. We must replace punishment with possibility. So today, as I accept this award on behalf of the Fountain Fund, I do so with a challenge to all of us. Let's not just honor second chances. Let's create them. Let's not just acknowledge injustice. Let's dismantle it. And never stop fighting for a world where redemption is not just a dream, but a reality for all. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, for seeing us. Thank you for believing in us. And thank you for standing with us as we build a future where justice belongs to all. Thank you, guys. Thank you to Thomas Jefferson Foundation and everything you've done for recognizing the Found Fund and the work that we do, not just here in our local community, but all across this great nation. We're trying to take over the world city by city. So please support us in our cause. Thank you, guys.
Want to thank you all for bringing the warmth and spirit of a beautiful community to a chilly spring morning where we're lighted by the remarks we've heard today. As a private nonprofit, Monticello receives no ongoing federal, state, or local funding to support our mission of preservation and education. Programs like Founders Day are only made possible by our generous community, including visitors like you. I also want to thank for adding immeasurably to this ceremony, Blue Ridge Event Production. Thank you for the tent. The Commonwealth Event Company, Ms. Diane Case Foster, who is providing our ASL interpretation. Our community partners, as the program concludes, please stop by the tent that's right behind you to learn about the work of local organizations in our community who advance the work of citizen service and citizen leadership. And there's a full list of partners in your program. You will also find family-friendly activities and performances, including Bill Barker as Thomas Jefferson throughout the day in the community partners tent. And with that, thank you all for coming up the mountain. Please come back and enjoy the spirit of the day.
Okay.